Thank you, Shannon, and thanks to everyone for coming out tonight to support MAPS Canada and the important work that's being done. And thanks to MAPS Canada for recognizing the importance of gender equity in this field of psychedelic research by hosting a panel of women. And I also want to acknowledge and encourage the importance of also prioritizing racial and ethnic diversity as well within this field, and all fields really. And this is being done by MAPS specifically, and other organizations like Chacruna. So tonight I've been asked to speak about why psychedelic research is important. My opinions do not necessarily represent those of my colleagues or my profession, though my arguments do stem from my responsibility as a family physician to advocate for public policy that supports the health and the welfare of my patients. So I'll be speaking from my perspective as a clinician, and also from my perspective as a white woman of privilege who's experienced 3 quite severe mental health conditions. One in my early and late teens and early 20s, an eating disorder, and then more recently, traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. Recovery from all 3 of these conditions has required the privilege that I enjoy, as I've spent tens of thousands of dollars on publicly uninsured healthcare services for my recovery. Just to disclose, I provide therapeutic services with Numinous Wellness Inc., which is an organization, a company that has a mission to advance and promote psychedelic therapy and research, and I have no financial disclosures. I'm having a bit of clicker trouble. Clicker's not working. Maybe I'll put it on my paper. Oh, there we go. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about my perspective because it relates to my arguments tonight. As mentioned, I'm a family doctor. I have a focused practice in chronic pain, which is a condition that affects 1 in 5 Canadians and is associated with 2 times the suicide risk of the general population. It's also associated with the worst quality of life of all chronic diseases and is highly associated with social determinants of health. I also am trained in functional medicine, which is a way of looking at health and disease that takes a systems biology approach and looks to detect root causes and then treat using lifestyle factors that are designed to shift the biology and change gene expression in order to promote health. As mentioned, I'm also a mindfulness teacher. I teach the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. And in that regard, I'm really helping to empower people with the medicine of awareness and using what I think is probably the most powerful modifiable lifestyle factor, which is your attention and where you place it, in order to shift your relationship to the stressors of life and the ups and downs of life. I'm also a relational somatic therapist, and in this regard, I use an understanding of the nervous system and interpersonal neurobiology, how we're wired to connect, to help people who've experienced adverse childhood experiences and traumas across their lifetime, which is most of us. And this system really recognizes the wisdom of the body and our innate capacity for healing by using present moment awareness and the felt sense to heal and to tap into our own healing capacity. And it also acknowledges that we're wounded and we're sick in isolation and we heal through connection. I was fortunate in 2011 when I first came to Vancouver to meet Dr. xwməthkwəy and to learn alongside him in the way that he was working with plant medicine and assisting people in preparation and integration of experiences, specifically helping people with addiction. And then also to train with MAPS to become an MDMA-assisted psychotherapist for the research that's currently being conducted. I'm also a student of spiritual traditions, Eastern and Indigenous, and I've used all of these perspectives in my own healing journey. So from this perspective, I want to outline part of the context from which I'm arguing that psychedelic research is important. Chronic disease, which includes chronic mental illness, begins in early childhood, when a child experiences certain environmental deficiencies. And these include adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, which have been well researched. I encourage you to look. Nadine Burke-Harris has a TED Talk that's really great explaining the research on ACEs. But also other social determinants like poverty, poor nutrition, and other social and physical factors in the environment. And this leads to chronic stress, which includes adaptations of the nervous system and the hormonal system and changes in the brain, all in an attempt to handle constant adversity. And what this leads to is chronic inflammation, immune suppression, and epigenetic modifications in gene expression, which ultimately massively contribute to the epidemic of chronic disease that we see, including diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune diseases, just to name a few. And then what we have is a disease care system that looks kind of more at the surface in these downstream symptoms and diagnoses, treating mostly with drugs and surgeries and other ways to suppress or otherwise alter what we see happening on the physical level. I want to go back to early childhood. Not only is chronic stress experienced, but also disturbances in attachment, which is our instinctual bonding that we do as mammals, as human beings, with whoever is there to take care of us. And when that is disturbed or not ideal, this causes attachment disruption as well as emotional dysregulation and disturbance, because without a safe relational home in order where we experience our emotions, a child is left to deal with that on their own, and it creates excruciating pain and leads to what in psychodynamics is called neurosis, or as Gabor Mate would call it, the personality, which is essentially, as he describes it, patterns of defenses that we use to insulate ourselves and to fragment ourselves internally so that we don't have to feel the intolerable pain that certain parts that we kind of shove away from awareness are holding. And this leads to neuroplastic changes in the brain, because what fires together wires together, and this is the principle of neuroplasticity. And the brain develops also, we develop an attentional bias. So the way we think, it reinforces how we think, and this shifts how we're perceiving the world. Also results in relational dysfunction. And then all of these things, chronic stress, the physiological factors above, are intimately linked with the factors below. And of course, we see an epidemic in mental health, addiction, depression, anxiety, PTSD, complex PTSD, suicide. And not surprisingly, these are by and large comorbid with chronic diseases, which means they happen in the same person, most likely due to their common root causes, as I've explained here. So I would ask, what about the upstream factors? And what about paying serious attention to social determinants of health? And what about mental health? There's actually a global crisis right now in mental health, and recent international commissions looking at global mental health have shown us that we really have a collective failure to respond. And they recommend a higher priority for mental health at parity with physical health, and that should be encompassed in universally accessible primary care. And the World Health Organization supports these recommendations and cites stigma, discrimination, and neglect as some of the barriers. I would also add intergenerational trauma, which perpetuates the disconnect that can lead to these other barriers. In Canada, only 7.2% of the healthcare budget is dedicated to mental health, which is the lowest of all G7 nations. even though 1 in 5 Canadians experiences mental health in their lifetime, mental illness in their lifetime, and that increases to 1 in 2 by age 40. And the Canadian Institute of Health Research only allocates 4.2% of their research budget towards mental health, even though mental illness accounts for more premature deaths than cancer and cardiovascular disease. But let's just not try and balance mental health and physical health. I hope you're understanding that mental health can't be separated from physical health. They're intimately connected and stem largely from how well connected we are with those around us as children growing up. Any successful aim to adequately support mental health must take a more holistic view. Like what is depicted by the medicine wheels of so many Indigenous nations. There we go. We got a click delay. Like this one that I received from a Siksika elder, which clearly physical health is balanced with mental and emotional health and spiritual health, which is relevant when we're talking about psychedelics. The positive outcomes that we see in the studies looking at psilocybin and LSD, classical psychedelics for end-of-life anxiety and treatment-resistant depression, show that the outcomes are better when the participants have had a mystical experience and have rated that experience as one of the most spiritually significant experiences of their life. Traditional systems like Chinese medicine and Ayurveda have recognized holism for millennia. And really, whole human health, as I've said before, acknowledges that we heal in connection, and our connections are fundamentally important to who we are, physically, mentally, emotionally, and who we become. So, we clearly need new approaches, not only new treatments, but an entire paradigm shift in how we think about mental illness. Current medications are not effective for many people. They cause a lot of side effects, or can do. They're typically taken every day over long periods of time to suppress symptoms, and can often take several weeks to achieve a desired effect. Psychotherapy alone, while positive and generally more accepted by patients than medications, takes a long time, is poorly accessible, as I mentioned, and can be difficult and not as effective in especially severe or treatment-resistant cases. So, psychedelic research is not only offering promising new treatments to address some of these mental illnesses we've talked about, but it's also contributing to an understanding of mental illness that starts to align much more with a whole human health approach. A more holistic model that validates psychological injuries that arise in a social environmental context, particularly those that happen as the brain is developing, as the deeper causes and underlying factors of mental illness. So, this is where research on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy becomes important. While some may see it as a new approach, really it's not, since the modern research that protocols that have been designed are really drawing from centuries of indigenous wisdom and healing traditions where psychoactive substances have been given in carefully created ceremonial contexts to elicit healing or religious or spiritual experiences. So psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy involves episodic administration of episodic administration of drugs as opposed to daily chronic use. And, we'll go back. This happens in a supervised therapeutic setting and harnesses the neurobiological or the experiential benefits of the drug, the psychedelic, to augment and accelerate the change process of psychotherapy. This approach emphasizes the innate wisdom and capacity to heal that we all have, and aims to resolve the root causes, not just manage or suppress symptoms. So before I go on, I want to stress that while psychedelic therapy is my keen interest, psychedelics are a part of possible solutions to the crisis we're facing. we also have to address poverty, and we also need to pay better attention and better support young families with children, particularly in their first 2 years of life, which is a critical window for attachment and brain development. So I wanted to just briefly outline here, and I won't go into depth because the other speakers are going to be talking more on some of this, but some of the encouraging research that we've seen recently. Treatment-resistant depression is one indication. Ketamine is actually a psychedelic that's had the most research of all of them. Typically that's been done in a setting where it's just been administered as an IV treatment without psychotherapy. There's a need right now to look at ketamine assisted psychotherapy, so psychotherapy and ketamine combined with a hypothesis that this will actually be more effective than just giving the drug itself. Psilocybin is also being investigated in early trials for treatment-resistant depression. There's been extensive research by MAPS now. Over 30 years, MAPS has been working on researching MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treating post-traumatic stress disorder. And so phase 2 was complete. It's now in phase 3, which is the final stage for drug approval by the FDA in the United States. And the phase 2 pooled data showed that 67% of participants no longer met criteria for PTSD 12 months after they exited the treatment. And they received 3 MDMA-assisted psychotherapy treatments along with preparation and integration. End-of-life anxiety is another indication that psilocybin has been used for, Johns Hopkins and NYU. It's a really important I think extremely important thing to look at, especially here in Canada where we have access to medically assisted dying. Psilocybin, there's a group called TheraPsil that are working to really promote acceptance of psilocybin as an option for end of life, because in the research so far it's shown to be very effective at alleviating symptoms of anxiety, depression, and existential distress after only 1 session. And these are enduring effects that last up to 6 months follow-up. Tobacco use disorder, so there's been a pilot study looking at psilocybin for tobacco use disorder, and 67% had sustained cessation at 12 months. That was a smaller open label study, just 12 participants, so needs further research. And there's studies looking at alcohol dependence with LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, ayahuasca, cocaine dependence with ketamine, opiate use disorder, ketamine and ibogaine, suicidality with ketamine and psilocybin, as well as OCD and social anxiety, and a number of further indications. The psychedelic field is definitely mushrooming right now, which is a good thing. Yeah, pun intended. So I just want to go back to this original diagram and just talk about how psychedelics can be part of the solution for what I mapped out here. So some of the psychedelic research is showing us, and this comes out of Bristol, the work of Robin Carhart-Harris in the UK, that classical psychedelics disrupt a network in the brain called the default mode network. And what this gives us access to is it disrupts the rigidly held patterns of thinking and allows for new neural connections to be made, increased connections across the hemispheres of the brain, which can allow for there's Robin, that's him, and that's kind of what the connectome looks like of the default mode network in the brain with the functional magnetic resonance imaging they're using. And so this allows for greater repertoire of connections and supports taking new perspectives, creative problem solving, ahas, big insights. And it also enhances neuroplasticity. So ketamine and classical psychedelics have been called neuroplastogens. It's a new term that I think is kind of cool. Or psychoplastogens, meaning that they increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor, increase the connections between synapses, and strengthen the dendrites of the axons, so the nerves where it connects to the next nerve, particularly in the prefrontal areas of the brain. And pathogens like MDMA have shown a reduction in the fear response and downregulation of the part of the brain that detects threat, called the amygdala, part of the limbic system. And this is really helpful, especially when working with post-traumatic stress disorder, because that decreased fear response enables access to memories and traumas to be able to work with them without going into a dysregulated state in the nervous system. And this also enhances trust, so enhances the therapeutic connection, and psychedelics have also been shown to enhance pro-social attitudes. And also experiential state changes that can really give access to emotionally cathartic releases. Bonding hormones are also released, like with MDMA, oxytocin and prolactin are released, and these are social bonding hormones that happen when you hug or are with people you love and feel connected. So when combined with psychotherapy, this enables the healing of attachment wounds, corrective emotional experiences, and becomes a platform for addressing relational dysfunction. And it's been shown as well that psychedelics lead to long-term enhanced interpersonal closeness. The decreased fear response also enables metabolizing and releasing trauma from the nervous system, and also reduced character defenses, which enables more core self-work. So this can start to really go back into what's happened or how individuals have been affected in their early life and healing from that. Psychedelics also been shown to have enduring effects on the personality, including increased openness or trait openness, as well as self-transcendence, cognitive flexibility, and increased compassion and empathy for self and others. So if a psychological injury, like an adverse childhood experience, can have lasting negative consequences, is it not plausible that positive, cathartic, and even mystical type experiences that are reliably achieved with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy could induce long-lasting positive health outcomes? And this is what the early research is showing us. So when access to mental health care is increased, including access to innovative therapies, and when, if you were to add to this, better policies to address social determinants of health, there we go, then you start to get what looks like a healthcare system. I want to read just a quotation from Dr. Ben Sessa. He's a child and adolescent psychiatrist in the UK, working on MAPS research over there, currently a study looking at MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for alcohol use disorder. He says, "We are today at a place in psychiatry where general medicine was 100 years ago. In the late 19th century, patients were dying from infectious diseases, but the medical profession was yet to discover the miracle cure of antibiotics. Physicians knew all about infections, but were powerless to stop them. Then, in the 20th century, antibiotics were discovered, and this transformed the face of general medicine. Today, in modern psychiatry, we are similarly expert at the diagnosis, classification, and categorization of common mental diseases. As we understand the common root of these disorders, childhood trauma. But our current best treatments are unsuccessful at effecting a lasting cure. Instead, we provide a wide pharmacopoeia of medications which do little more than mask the symptoms of the underlying psychological problems. Psychedelic therapies provide an opportunity for patients, for the first time in their lives, to address and resolve those traumatic childhood memories, which could be as transformative for 21st century psychiatry as antibiotics were 100 years ago. We owe it to that population of patients to carry out this research." And the Global Commission that I mentioned earlier in the talk, part of their recommendations certainly involve where we could fit psychedelic research into, new opportunities in technology, investing more in treatments, more in research. And the Canadian Mental Health Association, which is a lobby group that presented to government last year a proposed Mental Health Parity Act bill, also suggests sustained research to continue innovating and to develop psychological therapies that are appropriate, effective, and that promote treatment acceptance. And so far in psychedelic research, the treatments have been widely accepted and well tolerated by those participants in the studies. Research for new medicines is also important for innovation and the evaluation of safe medicines. And importantly, evidence-based practice includes traditional indigenous healing practices alongside scientific evidence. So I'm almost done. Overtime. Oh, okay, I have 2 more slides. So just to summarize, really I see there's moral and ethical reasons we need to address unabated human suffering, end of life, psilocybin opportunities for people as a choice. Certainly there's economic arguments, which I've already spoken about, and scientific arguments to promote psychedelic research, and really for our governments to get involved in funding psychedelic research. MAPS has done a tremendous job, and it's all by volunteer donations by people like you. I really think Veterans Affairs and other organizations in government should be seriously looking at promoting this research, and we hope to see that. And finally, psychedelic research is at the forefront, helping to transform our predominant dualist Western narrative about health and disease back towards one which embraces our wholeness as humans who need wholesome connections with each other. So I'll just end by giving mention to a research proposal that I'm working on with my colleague, Dr. Pamela Kreisgau, to investigate MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for treating chronic pain. So your support of MAPS Canada may help to fund this research and other important research. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So today I'm going to be talking to you about MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. Okay, good, it works. So we're going to be talking about MDMA, which is 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine. It's structurally similar to amphetamine, but it's been chemically tweaked to have some psychedelic effects. And you can see the structure of it does resemble some of our endogenous neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, and it causes a release of these and other neurotransmitters in the brain, but especially serotonin. MDMA is classified as an empathogen, meaning it really increases feelings of empathy, oneness, connectedness, openness, but it's also been called an enactogen because that means to touch within, and it really increases self-awareness and insight. I'd just like to mention that, as Devon mentioned, this work is based in indigenous cultures around the world that have been working really with using plants and fungi to induce non-ordinary states of consciousness in the service of healing. What we're talking about today is not just MDMA, but a drug-assisted psychotherapy, and this approach has been around for thousands of years. So what is post-traumatic stress disorder? Trauma is actually very common. It's part of the human experience. Here in Canada, in a politically stable country without war, about 75% of us will experience a traumatic event at least once in our life. But the most common response after trauma is actually to resolve that trauma. So only the lifetime prevalence of post-traumatic stress is 9.2%. So let's say some of us were in a serious car accident. If you met us, say, in the days or week following that, you might notice some of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Our nervous systems would be in high alert. We'd feel kind of stressed, jittery, irritable. We might not sleep well. We might have nightmares. But if you meet us a few weeks later, a month out, most of us will have resolved that. However, a subset of patients are not able to resolve the trauma, and they go on to develop post-traumatic stress. And I think Devon illustrated really beautifully one of the biggest risk factors for developing PTSD with a later index trauma is childhood trauma. So you can think of PTSD not so much as a disorder, but as getting stuck somewhere in that natural trajectory of resolving the trauma. And so what happens in people with PTSD is their brain, body, and soul is partially stuck in the past, and so their past is intruding into their present. So this presents with symptoms like nightmares, flashbacks of the trauma, intrusive memory fragments, and that will lead to their stress response kind of gets stuck in the on response, and they can't turn it off. And because part of them stuck in the past, they start to have a hard time discerning what's safe in the present, and that leads them to start avoiding things, and their world becomes very small. And avoidance maintains the post-traumatic stress because they aren't going out and experiencing the people, places, or things that would allow them to learn that the world actually can be safe. And then they start to develop stories and beliefs around what happened, often blaming themselves, and also believing that the world's a really dangerous place. And PTSD can often become chronic, and it's associated with very high rates of comorbid depression, suicide, and substance use disorders. So why? Well, first I'll say there are existing treatments for PTSD. There's 2 FDA-approved medications, Paxil and sertraline. You can see they have very low effect sizes. These are symptom management. They do not cure. They do not work at the root cause. There are evidence-based psychotherapies for post-traumatic stress, which, as you can see, have fairly high effect sizes. However, in chronic severe PTSD, there can be really high rates of dropout from these therapies. As people start to process their trauma, they get really overwhelmed with intense feelings, or else they dissociate and effective processing can't happen. So let's ask why MDMA, the question why MDMA for PTSD, and specifically why MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. So the first reason is that MDMA rapidly builds trust with the therapist. It really happens a lot faster than would be possible in traditional talk therapies. In the psychotherapy research, we've seen time and time again that it's the quality of the therapeutic alliance, it's the relationship between the therapist and the patient that's one of the biggest predictors of therapeutic success. However, in patients with PTSD, especially when the trauma has been interpersonal in nature or there's a history of childhood abuse, trust is very difficult. People in their lives who are supposed to take care of them have hurt them, and that causes people to close their hearts, and that can present as guardedness, defensiveness, and even aggression. And therefore, it can be really hard for them to open up and trust therapists. But what we see, MDMA causes this massive release of serotonin in the brain, and in particular through the binding of 5-HT1A receptors, we see this reduction in defensiveness and aggression. People subjectively report this really feeling close and open and increased trust. The other thing it does is release oxytocin in the brains. Many of you may have heard this is called the love chemical. It's released, for example, when mothers are breastfeeding to help them bond to their baby. And we think the exact role is still being delineated in MDMA and oxytocin, but it's certainly thought to sort of facilitate the therapeutic alliance. The next thing that MDMA does is it increases empathy. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of others, but also of yourself. And so MDMA increases empathy both for others and for yourself, and that's really important. Empathy for the self is closely related to self-compassion and forgiveness is very powerful medicine. One of the places that people with PTSD often get stuck is in a belief that they are somehow to blame for what happened to them, even when it was outside of their control. And the MDMA seems to allow them to go back to themselves at the time of the trauma and empathize with themselves then and forgive themselves. And that then paves the way for them forgiving others and for relational healing. I want to share a quotation for you from one of the veterans from the Phase 2 study. And the war trauma that bothered him the most was, in which he felt tremendous guilt, was when his friend was hit by a mortar blast and died in front of him. In one of the sessions, he had a vivid experience of meeting his friend's soul and being forgiven. So this is the quotation. The explosion hit. Seconds later, I'm standing over him. He looks up at me for salvation. I'm frozen in fear. Suddenly, everything stops. He stands up and walks to me and tells me it's okay. There was never anything I could have done. As I'm writing this, I still imagine that we are hugging in eternity. A moment fixated in time, an embrace of forgiveness, not just by my friend, but also for myself, to allow me to let go, understanding that I did what I could, and there is no reason to hold on to something that cannot be changed. My friend would want that. He wouldn't want his death to inspire pain for years and years to come, but rather love and forgiveness. I salute you, my friend, and I will never forget. So I think that quotation really wonderfully illustrates how this medicine can facilitate forgiveness and empathy. The next thing that MDMA does is it allows people to stay in something called their window of tolerance. So this is a principle that was a theory from Pat Ogden in sensory motor psychotherapy, and to process trauma, people need to be inside their window of tolerance, which is also called the optimal arousal zone. What happens in PTSD is the window of tolerance gets narrowed, so people oscillate between these states of hyperarousal and hypoarousal. In hyperarousal, they're flooded with really intense affect, sensations, intrusive imagery, and their ability to think clearly breaks down. But in hypoarousal, we see this deadening, dissociation, numbing, and again, effective thinking can't take place and processing becomes impossible. And MDMA increases people's window of tolerance, so it thus allows for more effective processing. So how does it do that? In terms of it reducing anxiety, so I mentioned that it binds these 5-HT1A receptors and also binds something called alpha-2 adrenoreceptors. So these increase relaxation and decrease the intensity of the hyperarousal. But what's really interesting about MDMA is it also increases cortisol, dopamine, and norepinephrine in the brain. And these neurochemicals increase alertness and kind of help people be more aroused. So it's both relaxing and arousing at the same time. And we think that's a big part of how it widens that window. And unlike a lot of other anxiolytic medications, meaning medications that reduce anxiety, MDMA improves cognitive clarity and the ability to introspect. So just to give you again a couple quotations from patients. I have respect for my emotions now rather than fear of them. What's most comforting is knowing that I can handle difficult feelings without becoming overwhelmed. I realize feeling the fear and anger is not nearly as big a deal as I thought it would be. Another patient. I felt deeply connected to painful feelings of the traumas as I saw them go by in spheres, but it didn't cause intense anxiety. I felt deep sadness in my heart, crying, but also happiness that I was healing and letting it go. So now let's look inside the brain of people with post-traumatic stress. So some of the findings that have now been replicated many times, the first is we see hyperactivity in what's called the amygdala. And you could think of the amygdala as the smoke detector of the brain. So it's going to detect threat in your environment and kind of signal the alarm. So it turns on your what's called your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is your stress response in the body. That's your fight or flight nervous system. And what happens is when it's enlarged and hyperactive in PTSD, their stress response gets turned on more frequently, even to more benign emotional stimuli. Oh, sorry, getting ahead of myself. The other thing that we see that's been replicated now again and again is shrinkage of something called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is really important for the long-term storage of memory. it's also one of the off switches for that stress response. And so when it's shrunk, it's harder to turn off the stress response, and it disrupts the consolidation of memory from short to long term. We also see decreased activity in what's called the prefrontal cortex, and that's the home to our executive function. So it's our ability to think logically, to plan, to make decisions, to solve problems. The medial prefrontal cortex in particular, the medial prefrontal cortex, you could think of it like the watchtower of the brain. So it's sort of observing what's going on, predicting what's going to happen, and helping you make a conscious choice of how you want to act. And it's the part of the brain that's actually enlarged in meditators, and it works closely with the amygdala to turn off the stress response. So, for example, let's say you smell burning, your amygdala is going to detect that as a threat, danger, danger, but it would be your medial prefrontal cortex will scan the environment and notice, actually, there's toast burning, and it's just toast. So then that would be coupled with your amygdala to turn off the stress response. But when that activity is decreased in PTSD, and those two parts of the brain are decoupled, and so we see this failure of fear extinction. Then when we look inside the brain on MDMA, we actually really see the opposite changes. So first of all, we see reduction in the amygdala. So it reduces the intensity of fear and allows people to process their trauma without being so overwhelmed by the intensity of the fear. We also see increased activity in the prefrontal cortex. And so that allows people to approach their traumatic memories with this capacity for cognitive clarity and introspection. We also see greater crosstalk between the amygdala and the hippocampus on MDMA, and we think that that facilitates the consolidation of traumatic memory into long-term storage. And once a memory is in long-term storage, it doesn't intrude into the present as much, and it becomes stored like other memories of someone's life. The fourth reason that we think MDMA is really helpful for PTSD is that it facilitates a corrective emotional experience. This is especially true when the trauma was interpersonal in nature. For some people, being on MDMA with two therapists is the first time in their life that they've ever felt both safe and connected at the same time. It really helps people be embodied and overcome habitual dissociation, and rediscover or discover for the first time that it can feel really good to open up and trust. It's been described as a heart-opening medicine, and when people share themselves and make themselves vulnerable and open up and are met with two therapists who are there with compassion, with respect, and with validation, very deep healing can be possible. And a quotation, "I had never felt before what I felt today in terms of loving connection. I'm not sure I can reach it again without MDMA, but I'm not without hope that it's possible. Maybe it's like having an aerial map, so now I know there's a trail." Finally, MDMA facilitates these really interesting and innovative shifts in people's thinking. We think this is partially mediated at the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, which allows the taking of new perspectives of past experiences and current reality. Robin Carhart-Harris, who's one of the neuroscientists that Devon showed his photo, he studied both psilocybin and MDMA, and he found that in both, there's this decreased resting state functional connectivity between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. And he attributes that connection, the decrease in that connection in psilocybin, produces this unconstrained style of cognition that is sort of the inverse of the constrained ruminative style of thinking that's seen in depression. And similarly, patients on MDMA describe this liberation of cognition and imagination that breaks them out of the negatively skewed thinking that we see in PTSD. Mendel Kaelin, who's another neuroscientist, particularly studies music and psychedelics, had an analogy where he talked about the habitual thought patterns and information flow in the brain are like sleds going down a snowy hill. So the more that they take the same track, the track gets deeper and deeper, and it's harder for the sled to deviate. And he was suggesting that you could think of MDMA, psilocybin, and psychedelics as sort of flattening the snow, or like a new fresh coat of snow, so the sleds are more able to take alternative routes. So I'll just really briefly show you the study design in phase 3, which is currently underway. So there are 3 MDMA sessions that are bookmarked by preparatory sessions and integration sessions. And then there's a pretty intensive screening process. There's always 2 therapists, typically male and female. We're dosing up to 180 milligrams, so usually 120 milligrams with a supplemental dose at 1.5 hours, so 60 milligrams. This is our room in Montreal where we're running one of the phase 3 sites. So we're really trying to create a safe container, very welcoming, non-clinical, comforting. So let's look a little bit at the data. This data is from one of the first phase 2 studies that was published. In this data set, we had a group of about 20 patients. These people had severe chronic PTSD. In order to get into the studies, you had to have failed pharmacology and psychotherapy. And people in this trial had PTSD for an average of 20 years. 40% of them had trauma, which was childhood sexual abuse, and 15% were on disability. So we see here that at 2 months, 83% no longer met criteria for PTSD versus 25% of the placebo. And when we look at them 12 months later, the vast majority, 88%, had maintained their gains, and 15% of people that were on disability were back in the workforce. There's also this thing that's seen where we see an increase in what's called post-traumatic growth, which you can think of sort of as the opposite of post-traumatic stress, where a traumatic experience seems to accelerate sort of evolution of the soul or personal development. So people who are experiencing post-traumatic growth report like a shift in their priorities. They tend to sometimes change their work. They have more of a spiritual orientation, and they spend more time on things that are important to them, like relationships. And we see a pretty significant increase in post-traumatic growth, 1 year out. And with the phase 2 data, it's now been completed. There were 6 phase 2 studies, and at 12 months, 68% of people no longer met criteria for PTSD. And of the other percentage, they had significant reduction in their symptoms. And those results are replicated in a variety of types of trauma, so in veterans, in first responders, in people who had sexual assault, people who had experienced war, natural disasters, and childhood abuse. So just to give you a sense of where we're at currently, so phase 3 is underway at 16 sites in North America and 2 in Israel. Expanded access should be starting hopefully this summer in the States. So that's where people can access, clinics are going to be hopefully able to access MDMA-assisted psychotherapy prior to it being approved. Phase 2 is starting in the Netherlands, and phase 3 negotiations are underway in Europe. So I just want to take a moment to tell you about our first participant in the Montreal study. He made this bowl for future participants, so that's why that photo's up there. And the first patient we run through, we knew he was getting MDMA. It was an open label trial because it was to make sure that our therapists were up to sort of protocol adherent. And he gave me permission to share his story. Excuse me. So he's a 30-year-old man who had developed severe post-traumatic stress. The trauma happened about 10 years ago when he was illegally smuggled from Iran to Canada. And during that journey, there were a number of severely traumatic things that happened to him. His life was threatened multiple times, and he was sexually assaulted. So when he arrived in Canada, he developed severe PTSD. He had intense nightmares, really intense flashbacks. He became very avoidant. He would have these attacks of rage, which were very distressing to him. He had a wife and a 2-year-old at the time of the study, and I think the rage was one of the things that was most distressing to him. He couldn't go anywhere near train stations, airports, anything that reminded him of travel. And he would describe that he had this 2-year-old who he loved, but he said the love felt cognitive, like he couldn't really connect to her at a heart level. So at the end of the study, his CAPS had come down almost to zero. Almost all of his PTSD symptoms were gone. He and his family were actually able to meet a dream of moving to Spain, where his wife was from. He was able to start traveling again. Previously, he had a lot of social anxiety, but he was able to speak with me and my other co-investigator at a large study, at a large conference in Toronto in front of like at least 600 people. None of that would have been possible prior to the study. He was very connected to his daughter, and he was starting to pursue his dream of working as a life coach. And he actually hopes to bring MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to refugee and migrant populations in Spain. So this is, we hope, the future, and it's not that far away. If things are going sort of according to plan, it is likely that the FDA will approve MDMA-assisted psychotherapy by 2021, and we're hoping Health Canada will not be too far behind. These are some other MDMA studies that have been completed. So you can see that there's, some of these were mentioned already, but there's been studies on life-threatening illness with the existential distress. We see there was a study on social anxiety in autistic adults. And Wagner's here, and so she's going to talk to you more about some of the couples work that's been happening, as well as combining MDMA with some of the evidence-based treatments for PTSD, such as cognitive processing therapy. So in a similar vein, MDMA is going to be combined with prolonged exposure. There's a study coming up in Canada actually combining MDMA with emotion-focused therapy for eating disorders. And there's some work coming up in alcoholism. So there's really exciting work in this area and in other psychedelic compounds, and the future's bright. Thank you so much.
Okay, hi everyone. This is so great to be here, and I was reflecting and I get the opportunity to have the stage in a number of different contexts, and this is the first time I've ever been on a panel with all women, and this is amazing. And I really want to thank Devon and Emma for that amazing setup, because I feel like I get to just roll into this talk and start talking a little bit more about the therapy and where we're going with the therapy when it comes to combining it with MDMA. And particularly, something that's really dear to my heart is the relational context. So talking specifically about how we're using it in relationship to heal. So what I got as my title here is MDMA is Therapeutic Catalyst, working with couples and cognitive behavioral treatment for PTSD. So really, I'm going to focus on those two components, this idea of couples work and cognitive behavioral treatments, which sometimes, especially if folks know anything about this space or know anything about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, they go, cognitive behavioral, why on earth would you do that with a psychedelic? And so I'm hoping to illuminate that a little bit and talk about why I think it's important for us to look at lots of different ways of doing therapy with psychedelics, because that is so important when it comes to how we're actually going to be using them going forward. And especially when we start thinking about taking it out of a context when we're using it for diagnosis, and we're using it more for health and wellness as well. And so I'm hoping that that's where I'm going to take us today in my talk, is to show how this could be actually the route forward into bringing it beyond psychiatric diagnosis into greater work. All right, so thinking about expanding the use of MDMA in therapy. Starting off, here we go. Okay, so relationships are really fundamental in our worlds. Be they present or absent, supportive or stressful, they are things that influence how we walk through the world and how we interact together. And they really, really influence how we heal from things when they're not feeling aligned enough for us. And MDMA's empathogenic qualities really are ideal for working with relationship. And MDMA's ability to foster tolerance and acceptance of emotions is so key. The ability it has to support communication and to support feelings of connection, even when you're dealing with things that are really, really challenging or really traumatic. The ability that MDMA has to support that work is really phenomenal. So therefore, it's potentially a powerful tool to work with relationships, and this is a burgeoning area. What's really important to know, though, is that it's had a history of using couples therapy well beyond now. This is not new. We did not invent this idea. And it was used as an adjunct to psychotherapy until 1985 when MDMA was scheduled. And it's predominantly used for relationship distress, for PTSD, and for anxiety. And the early use in couples therapy is well documented. So Anne and Sasha Shulgin used in couples therapy. Anne is a lay therapist, so Sasha was the chemist who reinvigorated MDMA's use and brought it out into therapeutic context. And Anne, his wife, would be the one who would often be taking it out and using it in a therapy context with folks. And so she was really key in pioneering its use in couples therapy. And then George Greer and Ripley Tolbert, they were also doing this work in the 80s, and they published some really seminal work, which is some of the things that we've been drawing on in terms of our ideas and moving it forward. So I've had the real privilege of talking with both Anne and George this past year about the work they did and how we're trying to take it going forward, and feeling really excited about incorporating these ideas that have been in play in the 70s, 80s, and now get to have their time again in terms of what we get to use and using the knowledge we have now with MDMA to take that forward. And when we think about mechanisms specific to healing trauma, specifically when we're thinking about the things that work so far in healing PTSD and trauma in particular, we think about non-avoidance. So specifically this idea of emotional, behavioral, and experiential. Experiential meaning the feelings we have within ourselves. When someone has PTSD, it is so natural to turn away from the things that hurt. It makes complete sense why you wouldn't want to be with the things that have caused you harm or you believe are causing you harm now. And so this idea of avoidance is central to keeping PTSD present, and it's really fundamental in terms of healing PTSD, to take away some of that avoidance. So that combined with meaning making, and meaning making around trauma is central to the idea that when we get stuck in a traumatic experience, and particularly our thoughts about it, it's often because the meaning we've made does not make sense with our internal world. And so to be able to introduce a different way of making sense of what's happened, how it's influenced us, and how we go forward is really key. And then the third thing is enhancing the relationship. And we've seen with longitudinal studies over time that when you have less negative social support, so that specifically means less interactions that are difficult between people that are not supportive, you get less PTSD. And over time, PTSD can erode your social support. And so what that means is the longer the PTSD is there, the harder it is to have a relationship in which it can be healing. And so the idea of using the relationship actually to help heal the PTSD prevents it from continuing and is able to actually heal the whole system and not just the person with PTSD. So when we think about treatments for PTSD, what do we need to work on? First of all, we need treatments that work. And because right now we have treatments that work for some people some of the time, and that's often when they do. But our treatments do not work for everyone. Also, we want the idea that we want to create options and choice for treatment. That's so fundamental. When folks are given a treatment and they don't want to do that treatment or not motivated in that moment, it's not going to work. And so to be able to offer that opportunity to choose a treatment that fits for the experience that they want to go through at that time is going to make the treatment's efficacy far better. Additionally, we don't know for whom, why, and when something does work. So that's a question we have. Knowing that and also bringing in the system. So bringing in the context in which trauma occurs and then is healed is fundamental in terms of being able to take healing forward. And also, can healing be even more profound? Can we see fewer symptoms? Can we see healing in other domains, so not just the trauma itself, but can we see healing in terms of relationship, in terms of depression, anxiety, other outcomes that go along with it, in terms of quality of life, and also for other people? Is it possible that when we do this work, can we heal not only one person, but potentially a partner, a family, a community at the same time? So when we think about PTSD in couples in particular, we know that trauma impacts not only the individual, but also everyone surrounding them. It's impossible to keep trauma in a vacuum, right? It exists within the context in which we live. So therefore, treating the aftermath of trauma in the context of relationships has really strong potential power. And approaching the healing of trauma as a system is actually more likely to keep the changes in place. And so you can see that that would stick for longer. I'm working on a computer and a thing here, so I'm going to go back and forth and make sure that I'm actually doing what I'm saying doing. Okay, so why then would we combine MDMA with a treatment that already exists? So this treatment is called Cognitive Behavioral Conjoint Therapy for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, CBCT. And CBCT has shown on its own, without MDMA, decreases in PTSD symptoms, increases in relationship satisfaction, and improved partner functioning in a number of different trials. So that means that on its own, it works for a chunk of people that get it. And in our best trials, we see about 60% of people lose their PTSD diagnosis with CBCT. That's really good. However, 40% of people are still not losing their diagnosis. So what does that mean? That means we need another option, another treatment. And to give you a little bit of context about me, so I started, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I started a postdoc doing PTSD treatment development research on this treatment. Oh, I realized that didn't show up. Here it is. On this treatment. And Candace Monson was my postdoc supervisor, and she developed this treatment with Stephanie Friedman. So when I started this work, I knew zero, absolutely zero about psychedelics, and this was in 2013. And we got a phone call from someone named Rick Doblin from Max, asking if perhaps we might want to collaborate on doing some work, because an introduction had been made between Candace's colleagues at the VA, where she used to work, and Rick. And the idea being that the folks at the VA said, well, this is interesting, and it sounds like it might work really well with couples therapy and with MDMA's properties. And so we thought, okay, yeah, that would make sense. And so Rick and Michael Mithofer and Amy Mithofer called Candace and asked if she'd want to collaborate. And I got, as a postdoc, got pulled into the office, and the first question I was asked was, so Anne, do you want to go to South Carolina and take some MDMA? And I said, yes. And then why? So it was the second question, knowing nothing about this and never having taken a psychedelic before. So this is one of the really fascinating things about my journey into doing this work, and being a really passionate advocate for this work now, is that my entry point into doing this and my first psychedelic experience was in an FDA-approved trial for therapists to get an MDMA therapy experience. So I got to have an MDMA therapy experience with Amy and Michael as my therapists, and get to have a first-hand view of what it's like to have that seminal experience. I am lucky that at that point in time, I was not living with PTSD, so therefore I didn't have that experience of moving through that, but I did have my own very seminal and important therapeutic experience within that. And that was what convinced me to do this work and really shift my whole life and career and everything into focusing on this. That was so powerful. And that's a real testament to Max's work in terms of making that accessible to convinced therapists like me who knew nothing about it and were treatment development researchers and going like, oh, this has power. And that's now shifted a lot. And so that experience helped me shape the idea that ended up becoming this study and combining it with the couples work, because I was able to understand how those pieces potentially got to fit together. So when we think of adding MDMA then to CBCT, we know that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD shows decreases in PTSD symptoms, and we saw that from some of the data that Emma presented. And therefore, we knew that we want to combine these two ideas, these two approaches together to see, could we facilitate even deeper healing within a relational context? Could we take it there? Could we show and bring forward this work that had been started in the 80s that we're working with in the 90s, 2000s, and now into the trauma work and combining those two approaches together? So that's why we put these things together into the pilot trial for the couples work for MDMA with PTSD. So what is CBCT? So CBCT on its own is usually 15 sessions of psychotherapy. They're usually about 75 minutes long, and it's divided into 3 different phases. So phase 1 is psychoeducation, so talking about trauma together with a partner. In the pilot study we did, they were all romantic couples, but it doesn't have to be romantic couples. It could be any type of close other to you. So it could be a friend, a family member, someone you're close with and who's impacted by the trauma with you. So the first thing is to understand PTSD and understand how it impacts you and your relationship. And also safety building, because a lot of folks are very fearful about hearing about their loved one's trauma experiences, and the person with PTSD often doesn't want to share about those experiences. So we do a lot of work to build that safety, and especially safety also around anger and aggression that can come out, especially when someone's feeling really triggered. So we do that at the beginning. Phase 2 brings us into relationship enhancement, so we do work to help build the relationship and also reduce avoidance, which is really key. So we're doing a lot of skill building, really, to have a framework so people understand the work they're doing together. And a lot of that skill is around communication and sharing. And then in phase 3, we're working with meaning making, and that's specifically understanding how the trauma's been made sense of for both partners. And that's really key because both people have ideas of why it happened, why it's occurred, why it's sticking around, what the impacts are. And so we need to work through that together. And then what we did when we combined it with MDMA for the study design is that we put 2 MDMA sessions into the therapy at really specific key points in time. We did it at first after they learned the key communication skills, so they already had a framework to work on and a language to be able to share when things got difficult. And then we put the second MDMA session right in the heart of the trauma meaning-making work. And so they got another boost, a catalyst within there. And we did that on purpose because we thought that those would be the times that would really emphasize what was going on. So we ran this pilot study with 6 couples, with 1 person with PTSD and the other partner did not have PTSD. I want you to remember that for a second because it's going to come back around at the end. 1 person did not have PTSD. And both participants received 75 milligrams of MDMA in the first dose with an optional supplemental half dose. And in the second session, they could opt to go up to 100 milligrams plus an optional supplemental half. I believe everybody went up and everybody took the supplemental. Surprise! All right, so what does an MDMA session look like? Well, we wanted to we learned this along the way, but we wanted to maximize the time spent inside. So inside in an MDMA-assisted psychotherapy session means time spent in your internal world. It means not communicating with the other people in the room. And what we use eye shades and headphones, we had music playing. And then we would really coordinate conversation between the partners when one was ready to have that. We got much better at that as time went on. The first couple of couples coming in were like, oof, this is like conducting an orchestra, trying to make sure everyone's, having enough time inside because we really wanted to maximize each person's experience. And we allow for whatever cognitive, emotional, somatic material comes up in those sessions. So we didn't do any teaching, any practicing of skills. There's no delivery of content of CBCT in the MDMA sessions. They happen, that's before and after. The MDMA session is what it is. And then we use the CBCT to prep and integrate it. And we're really supporting non-avoidance by encouraging embodied and experiential learning. So having that salient experience in those MDMA sessions of feeling what it feels like to not have to avoid in those moments, and to be able to experience your emotions, have your thoughts, look at the trauma memory without having to turn away from it. Because that's extremely difficult to do with PTSD without that support. And this is the therapy room that we used. And you see there's 2 recliners, so that's where the couple would sit and they'd be able to rotate so they could face each other, be side by side, laying back, and you're in the therapist view right there. So that was the chair we had. And then when they needed closer support, we'd come in little camper chairs beside those recliner chairs. So I'm going to show you some results from the pilot. So this is PTSD outcomes. I'm going to walk you through this. So the first line is the CAPS. The CAPS is a clinician-administered PTSD scale. So that means an independent rater, so not one of us as the therapist, someone who was at arm's length in the study. They did the CAPS. And the CAPS is the kind of gold standard outcome measure. And a drop of 10 points is clinically significant. And here you see that our pre-treatment mean was 43. Our post-treatment mean was 16, and that's under the clinical cutoff for PTSD. And the effect size for that. So when we think of effect sizes, 0.3 is a small effect, 0.5 is medium, 0.8 is large. We had 1.95. That's ginormous. Granted, this is 6 couples, so it's like a taster, it's a teaser of showing it's got a good effect. Now the PCL is the PTSD checklist. So this is the participant themselves rating their own PTSD symptoms and their partner rating their symptoms. And so you'll see at the beginning, there's difference between those two. The patients had 61 as their mean, and the partners were rating them 48. So that means they had a different understanding of what PTSD looked like at the beginning. And by the end, they're very close, 20 and 18. Massive drops, 40-point drops on the PCL is huge. And we see the effect sizes there are 2.13 for the patient and 1.5 for the partner. And the difference in the effect size is because it actually had not as far to drop when you see from pre to post for the partner. And I took a few quotes out from some of the sessions, actually, from session tape. And I remember once we asked one of the participants, in the MDMA session, just out of curiosity, like, what do you think it would be like if PTSD wasn't present? And the participant said, well, PTSD isn't here right now. So to have that experience of being in that moment and going, PTSD isn't present in this moment in time, gives us a template to work with going forward. You get to have a different experience of what happens next. Another participant, in thinking about the experience, was saying, I feel like the weight is lifted. We started unraveling the strings that had been in knots, one at a time. And then the whole knot came undone. I feel different and it feels great. I never imagined there could be this much healing. Another participant said, thank you for giving me my life back and helping us with our marriage. I just have overall inner peace. It's amazing. There's no price anyone can pay for that. And in terms of the relationship then, what that looked like was, I'm using this as a taster of it. This item below says, on the scale below, please circle the number that best indicates the degree of happiness, all things considered, of your relationship in the past week. And 0 is extremely unhappy, 6 is perfect, 3 is happy. I never believe people when they say 6 on that scale. I'm like, there's absolutely no way everything's perfect in a relationship. It's always a little signpost. But here, they started off slightly unhappy, and by the end, they were all in the happy to very happy range. Okay, and I had one quote that a participant sent me over email and gave me permission to read here afterwards, and this was a year later. He said, the memories of that last year just poured out. It was hard to see and disturbing, but there was no pain or fear associated with them. Totally different than when we first met a little over a year ago. Hard to believe it's been a year. My life is totally different now, and I wanted you to know how deeply grateful I am for what you guys are doing. No words or all the thank yous in the world could express my gratitude. I have my life back, and for the first time in my life, I look forward to a renewed future. I live my life now with hope where despair ruled before. That's a pretty huge realization for me. It's like a light has been shone into the darkness of my soul. Pretty cool. With 3 exclamation marks. So, when I think about the frame of couple therapy and what we're doing, we've been reflecting on this a lot. And we think really, well, especially when working with couples, a structure is helpful because you're creating a safe and mutually understood framework for what's happening and how to talk about it. And so having skills and tools to be able to work together to do that really facilitates being able to dive even deeper. And the idea of not having any expectations for MDMA sessions, but intention setting around them was really key. And we bring in through exercise the MDMA session itself not being structured and being non-directive, and allows for a healing process to emerge naturally from an innate place the client can then begin to learn to trust. And so we really use that and use that in the integration as we go forward with the CBCT. We found that the cognitive flexibility was really key with MDMA, and that the CBT model for couples helped support that. And so that was the key thing about CBT, was that it integrated all these different components, including this idea of the meaning making. And the experiences in the body were addressed and worked with all within that frame. And the integration through the use of skills and tools afterwards was really helpful in creating a shared scaffold to tether the experience to. So what we see is this, I really feel like this can potentially be a true demonstration of healing potential with MDMA. And that combining these approaches together illuminates the possibilities of not only doing dyadic work, but also of integrating these treatments that we have that are protocol-based and help create the safety and structure for people to really dive into. So when I think of that, it's like almost to say, when you think about kids and setting boundaries with them, and this idea if you have a safe place to come back to as a kid, you're more likely to go out further and explore. And so that's actually, when I think about using CBT with psychedelics, that's what I think of. I think of a safe place to come back to, an understood structure, so you can dive really, really deep in those psychedelic experiences. And that's also why we're testing it with cognitive processing therapy. And that's because we're going to try it in an individual framework as well, with that idea of having that scaffold to be able to dive super deep into the healing and to have something to tether to in that experience. This is the thing I asked you to hold on to from before. We're able to demonstrate with clinical and non-clinical participants in an approved study, which means that there's a potential in the future to potentially use this as a gateway to showing healing and growth beyond psychiatric diagnosis. We're developing the data to show that it's safe and useful in that way. And because the impact of relationships affects everyone, and it's a doorway to broader use of psychedelics, and hopefully for all of our use in the future. So I want to thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. It's an honor to be here. I'm so grateful and humbled to be sharing the stage with these wonderful women who are definitely pioneers in this field. So my interest is the interface of using technology that we're all so familiar with. Everybody has a cell phone. We all have computers. We all spend a lot of time with technology these days. But a lot of our current use of technologies is about putting our attention and intention into whatever the device is demanding of us, as opposed to using these technologies to offer us a reflection back into our sense of self. So I'm really interested to see if there's a way where we can start to allow these personal devices to start to reflect back to us, because our attention and our intention are one of our greatest commodities. They're what help us reflect and understand our sense of self. They're what help cultivate these different neural networks that everyone is talking about, and that's what I'm going to share with you guys today. Oh, no. Help. Did my slides get opened up? Do a dance routine. Uh-oh. All right. So what I was going to talk about, once I get my slides, 2 minutes, okay. So the idea that I was going to start with was learning to direct your attention and your intention is something that I do a lot with neurofeedback. And so Anne was talking about using cognitive therapies to help give people this framework or an anchor for them to come back to. And I, when I'm talking with my clients, look at the cognitive behavioral aspect of it as more as doing the laundry. Well, I'm really interested in sorting the laundry before we do the laundry. So I want to introduce you to starting to consider these states, all these body states. So I'm interested in creating a safe container for people to come back to within themselves in their interoceptive awareness. So one way of doing that, perfect. State shifting. So the way you can shift your state is by where you put your attention and your intention. So let's imagine for a moment that we're outside and that you're gazing at the clouds. And just notice, how does your body respond to that? Because your body doesn't know the difference between what's actually happening in the moment and where your attention and your intention have been directed. Now let's shift and imagine that you're starting to work on a project, something that you've really got to get done next. What happens to your body? Does attention change? Do you get a little more focused, a little more one-directional, as opposed to before when we were outside and we had this really open framework? Now bring your attention to your heartbeat. To add intention to that, you can start thinking of a time where you felt a lot of love and compassion for someone. And now bring your intention to the feeling of that love and compassion in your body. So these different ways of moving your attention around actually change your physical state. For example, even if you were starting to feel hungry and you started imagining eating a hamburger or something that you enjoy, your mouth would start to water. Your body responds to what you are thinking. Why are states important? Because we know that individuals, as everyone has presented tonight, are stuck in a different or a specific state if they have a different mental illness. For those with PTSD, they're kind of stuck in the past a lot of the time. But if we know how to transverse or transcend these states and we have a psychological flexibility, then we are able to connect with one another. We are able to meet the moment. We are able to meet the person in front of us. And we are able to have a sense of flow in our lives because we're not living in a predicted model or we're not living in a fixed model. We're living in a model that's actually meeting the moment as it comes. And therefore, we are allowing our states to wash over us to work with what's happening in each moment. And we also know that part of what we're looking for with psychedelic experiences is these mystical experiences. And research has shown us, as I'll get into that further, the state of surrender is very important for allowing us to have a mystical experience. So curiosity is kind of what seems to underlie a lot of the ability to state shift. If you're curious about the moment, you're present with the moment. You're also accepting of the moment, and you're allowing and trusting that you will be able to interact with it as it comes. Oftentimes, though, someone's judging the moment, they're predicting the moment, and that's the difference between having psychological flexibility, which is more curiosity-based, and is also telling your body that, hey, I'm paying attention to right here, right now, and right here, right now. I'm talking and everything's okay. Whereas if I was judging the moment and starting to really wonder what everyone was thinking, how's it going, that might bring some nerves into my body. It would get in the way of my ability to just allow things to flow. So here's a picture of kind of what it looks like to have a cap on your head or do some neurofeedback. So with neurofeedback, I'll either put single sensors on someone's head to read specific brainwaves, or I'll put an entire cap on their head that gives me an ability to take a picture of everything that's going on in the brain. In the middle, we were definitely working on enlightenment and trying to bring an awakening to his third eye. I think it definitely worked a little bit. So the first one that popped up is beta frequencies, and I'm going to kind of outline them all. But the beta frequencies, as you can look at this little map here that shows us the difference between conscious and subconscious. And why I'm bringing this up is because I'm going to be talking to you a lot about different frequencies, and this is how a neurofeedback practitioner works. Our frequencies in our brain are representative of different parts of the brain. So the beta frequency is mostly driven by the cortex, and as you can see, it's mostly happening when we're in a conscious state. Delta frequencies are deep in the subconscious. Delta actually directs a lot of our automatic processes. So the brainstem, your heartbeat, your digestion, that's kind of got its own rhythm. But that rhythm is often driven and started early in childhood. So when we think about the ACEs studies, delta is where children or babies are at until about the age of 2. Then theta is our limbic system, and this is the amygdala and the hippocampus that we heard about earlier with memories and our innate alarm system. And that is also developed and honed in childhood. Up until about the age of 7, children are predominantly in a theta state. Alpha is kind of the mediator, as you can see. It's the bridge between conscious mind and subconscious mind. And it's housed in the thalamus. So there's this theory of like a triune brain. We have our brainstem, which is our automatic processes, our defense mechanisms, our limbic system, which sits on top of that, and that's our emotional connection to others. And then on top of that is the cortex. But the thalamus is the realization between the mind and the body. So it's what gates and kind of sends the sensory information from the body to the cortex, and then back down into the body. Beta, I already talked to you guys about. And then gamma. Gamma is still a bit of a contentious brainwave, but it's really interesting. We'll see in experts, so expert meditators who are really adept at, say, a loving kindness meditation, in the area of their brain that's most active, they'll show a ton of gamma. It's like effortless doing. Musicians who really understand a piece of music, when they listen to the music, their brain lights up in gamma. It's effortless for them to understand. So this is one of my favorite Carl Jung quotes. I really enjoy him. And if you really think about what I just talked to you about, when he talks about when you make the unconscious conscious, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So when you think about the ACEs, and you think about delta, and you think about theta, and we know that those individuals, as they get older, are struggling with trauma, and they keep having these repetitive patterns. What Jung is really talking about is this early processing that we get. Any sort of predictive model that we have, that our body is kind of driving us, and our biases are driving us, until we become aware of those, we kind of just live by them, and we don't necessarily have choice. We are just reacting to these innate processes. So a recent study came out by Chris Timmerman about DMT, and I just chose this slide, and I'm seriously simplifying his research here, but he was talking about what they noticed when somebody was in the DMT experience is that beta and alpha decreased, and delta and theta increased. And the deeper the increase of alpha, which is that bridge, remember, between the conscious and the subconscious, the more that suppressed, the higher the intensity ratings were of individuals basically going into their subconscious and having these mystical experiences. Interestingly, though, in neurofeedback, one of the earliest protocols that was used was something called alpha-theta training. And it's something that I still use today. It's often used with trauma clients, individuals who are stuck with alcoholism or substance abuse, and also used for actual peak performance as well. So where they got a lot of this was Elmer Green, who was one of the early neurofeedback practitioners. He studied a bunch of different mystics by hooking them up to the kind of technology they had back in the day, and they would see that they would kind of drop their alpha and increase their theta. They actually did this research with Stan Grof also, who's expert at doing this in his own brain. And they also saw this with hypnosis patients. So again, right, the ability to transcend the ego, which is kind of housed in alpha, which I'll get to a little bit more soon, and go into the subconscious where our emotional vocabulary, these predictive processings are, is facilitated by our ability to drop and go into the subconscious state, which is driven by theta. So it's something I've become really interested in, and this was talked about by both Michael Winkelman and an anthropologist, who are both an anthropologist, and also Lumpkin, who's another anthropologist, is this idea of monophasic versus polyphasic consciousness. So in monophasic consciousness, our worldview is based on like a single state. So when we think back to that earlier slide on states, we saw that individuals who are stuck with different mental health disorders are actually stuck in a specific state. They're more of a monophasic. They see the world through a certain lens all the time, and they can't escape that state. On top of that, there's a little more rationalist, materialist, and behaviorist in their paradigms, so they're not moving into kind of the altered information, and reductionist. In a polyphasic state, we actually value altered states of consciousness, so dreaming, contemplation, ecstatic, transcendent states, normal waking consciousness is also involved. So it's really the ability to traverse all your different frequencies, kind of having that flexibility to go where you want in any given moment, which would allow you to be very curious and be meeting your moment as it comes. 90% of past societies were considered polyphasic. It's only in recent times that we've kind of gotten away from these embodied, deeper practices, which has actually created a little more rigidity in our interactions with the world. Part of what's polyphasic too are things like the ineffability that you get in a mystical experience. So for example, love. All right, see, even that, I don't know what happened. So what we're kind of looking for when we're entering more into polyphasic states is we're looking for the right state, which is the right tool for the right job. You have the flexibility to go where the moment is calling you. So we're all interested in the mystical experience, and we know that when somebody has a mystical experience, they're more likely to have a positive outcome from their psychedelic session. So here's just a general overview of what mystical experiences are. So an internal state of ineffable, noetic, kind of beautiful, transcendent openness. And I'm sure many of us here have experienced that in our own journeys of different levels. There's the transcendence of time and space, and emerging of intrinsic connectivity networks, which I'm kind of going to get into next. And it's something I haven't talked to you guys about yet. But you have heard about the default mode network several times from different speakers, and if you've read or heard much about psychedelic research, you hear a lot about the default mode network. So research where they were looking at trying to understand what dictates the likelihood of somebody having a mystical experience, they found that a state of surrender is actually the most likely predictor that somebody can enter into that state that they were going to have a mystical experience. Whereas barriers of mystical experiences were low states of surrender, kind of the psychological rigidity, holding on. I already said that. All right, so these are the intrinsic connectivity networks that I was talking to you about. And I find that one of the easiest ways to explain this is actually imagining a teeter-totter. So we have the default mode network on one side, and we have the central executive network on the other. So our conscious mind is actually anti-correlated. You're either out in the world and doing things, and this network is what helps you stay on task, like that focused person in the beginning, or you're thinking about yourself and you're self-referencing. And they're supposed to kind of switch back and forth. In a non-clinical sample, people can spend about 70% of their time in the central executive and 30% of their time self-referencing. But as pretty much everyone here had already talked about, there's a rigidity when somebody has a difficult mental health disorder, particularly PTSD. So instead of those guys teetering, they're either spending 70% self-referencing and they can't quite get out into the world, or they're so entwined that they're not even teeter-tottering back and forth. The salience network, however, is kind of the mediator between the two. And the salience network is really interfaced with the limbic system, and it's tied to the messages that we get from our body. So if the salience network, and salience means what do you notice in the world, both outside and inside, is so full of tension and fear and disconnect, then people don't even really want to experience it. The teeter-totter doesn't even move. They just kind of sit rigidly still. So what we want to have happen is all of these networks to be able to play together nicely. So you can think about yourself, you can stay on task, and then you can feel comfortable that the part in between is going to balance you. One of the most interesting things I saw, and this came from Robin Carhart-Harris, though, is that individuals, when they hit a mystical experience, these networks kind of collapse, and instead they unify. So here's an example of these networks and what they actually look like in the brain. And this was taken from a meditation paper showing somebody in a focused attention meditation. So in the front, with the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, so that's one of the hubs of the central executive, when they're on task, all their attention is right there in the front right hemisphere. When your mind wanders, the default mode, which look how spread out that is in your brain, it's a really supportive network in the brain. This is where mind wandering happens. Then the salience network up there at the top, which is the mind-body connection, actually notices, hey, wait, what the heck, I wasn't doing my attention before, I'm going to come back. And then the full central executive with the inferior parietal, which helps us kind of reference between ourselves and others, is activated as well, and then we come back to focus. So we can see how these networks kind of work together all the time when we are directing our attention. So something that I've been working with for a while, and this comes from Dr. Jeff Durant from the Neuromeditation Institute, is the idea of state education. And I'm really interested in the idea of if we start training people in the subtleties of their states, which is truly just training them in their own mental flexibility, which is really understanding how your neural networks work, would that help people better prepare for psychedelic experiences? So right now we found that focus meditation, for example, which is really your ability to totally control your attention, is more controlled by beta waves, is really helpful for people who have ADHD. Mindfulness, which is that ability to observe, like the clouds, is a soft, kind of open experience, which is more of a limbic or slower wave, and that's really good for people with stress and anxiety. Quiet mind is this spacious awareness, and that's driven by alpha, so that helps, again, disrupted sense of self. It's really helpful for PTSD as well, and OCD. And then open heart is this embodied compassion, and that's driven more by gamma waves, kind of hubbed more in the insula, which is tied to the salience network. And that's really helpful for depression and relationship issues. So again, another Carl Jung quote. He said, "He who would fathom the psyche must not confuse it with consciousness, else he veils from his own sight the object he wishes to explore." So what I'm trying to delineate here is that the psyche is more made up of these intrinsic connectivity networks, the cascade of brain waves that helps us understand where we are in our conscious state. Whereas consciousness itself, still the greatest mystery, seems to be driven by the health of our body and the health of these networks. So wouldn't it make sense if we started kind of working with these networks the way we do with our body? So the central executive, you can imagine it's like flexing and working your arms. Alpha is like getting a good core workout, and then theta and delta, so it's leg day. And you need them all. Or you can imagine it's also like dentistry, right? We've got to floss our networks to make sure they don't get stuck and have a lot of plaque on them. We want to keep them flexible and dynamic so that we can have that ability to shift our states. So again, this quote from Lumpkin was that cultures who are polyphasic in their approach have flexible use of neural networks in such a way that they can more easily access a variety of perceptual processes. And then a recent study came out where they took expert meditators and they gave them psilocybin, and then they looked at their brains and they found that they maintained this flexibility in their default mode network. And these meditators were really able to reflect on the fact that, wow, I could just drop into my meditation even that much more easily. So pairing meditation with psychedelics is something that is starting to be studied. But these are expert meditators. These are people who've taken, years to learn this skill. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could be using brain-computer interfaces to teach us these skills a little more quickly, and then also for a clinical population, soften their networks a little more quickly to help them achieve these mystical experiences that we're looking for with psychedelics? So that's kind of what I just said. So my own research was actually taking neurofeedback and taking the research from magic mushrooms and kind of seeing if I were to just put a sensor on the back of the head, which is where the main hub of the default mode network is, and then looking at the psychedelic literature, we saw with psilocybin that everything from delta, from 1, up to about low beta, 20, seemed to be kind of inhibited in somebody's brain. So we decided, okay, let's see what happens if we do that ourselves. And this was interesting because in our lab, we've been studying dissociation, and we've noticed that individuals who have dissociation, which is one of the symptoms of PTSD, when they close their eyes, normally we see an increase in alpha. So we see an increase in feeling our embodied state. Instead, they close their eyes and they saw a decrease in alpha. And we're like, oh, that's really interesting. But then wait a second, all the psychedelic literature started coming out, and we said, oh, also psychedelics seem to do the very same thing. So we were wondering, we were also looking at what would happen if we brought alpha down. Then we would see that there was a rebound afterwards from just watching the alpha, and this was really helpful for people with trauma, but it was a little bit jarring because it kind of just brought them back into themselves. So then when we saw this with psychedelics, we started experimenting with the idea of just broadening the range of frequencies that we were working with, and that's basically what I studied. And then we found, when we compared it to some of the mystical experience scores with psilocybin and MDMA, that it was not unlike these two. So with experiences of unity, blissful state, insightfulness, disembodiment, anxiety, and audiovisual synesthesia, we saw that there was a similar reporting on the scale following somebody's experience. And this was about a 15-minute experience with neurofeedback. So I'd have them looking at a screen, and I was playing a bunch of mandalas on the screen. And the feedback that they received, and that you would often receive with neurofeedback, is either audio or visual. So in this case, it was visual. So in order for them to be rewarded, they would have to quiet the default mode network. And when they quieted the default mode network, the screen would appear clear. However, when they would start thinking again, self-referencing, the screen would get foggy and they would lose what they were watching. So then I would also get them to give me a report of how they felt in the 24 hours following the study. And what I was seeing is that it was actually very similar to a lot of the microdosing studies, was that people had an elevated mood, increase in focus. I remember one girl telling me that while she was sitting there, she felt like all these issues she was having were being resolved. People told me that afterwards they were able to focus and get their work done. This was my personal experience, so before I really knew what was going on here, I was like, I'm going to experiment it myself. So I was giving myself neurofeedback about twice a week, and I just started using it really early in the morning because I found I was extremely productive after that and very creative. And as I started to unpack this, I was like, oh, of course, that makes sense. I calmed the rigidity in my brain and kind of opened myself up to a little bit more creativity. Thanks.
I'll try to make this sound like a question. It's for any of you. Excuse me. When you were all talking about PTSD, it seems to me, I'm hoping this will lead quickly into a question, that maybe it's not defined specifically as PTSD, but that we're all stuck in the past to one degree or another, and to a large degree, we all have this buried material. So I'm just kind of wondering, could the PTSD definition be broadened somewhat, or something like that kind of a question?
Yeah, I think we probably all have something to say about that. I'll start. Certainly there is a spectrum of trauma. And I think there was an iceberg image in Heather's talk, and I like to look at it that way. PTSD being like the very tip of the iceberg. It's really the most extreme presentation, like has been shared with when the nervous system and the alarm system is just completely stuck on. And I can speak from my own experience having PTSD. The experience is like having the nails on a chalkboard be like your skin, and your nervous system feels like an uninsulated, frayed wire, and there's no turning it off. And this is why people commit suicide and use alcohol and other things to try and turn it off, because it's not doing it on its own. And then the spectrum of trauma is, yes, as you say, we all have our own early adverse experiences. Nobody has a perfect childhood, and so there's a spectrum of ways that we are resilient or not in facing life's challenges. So I think we all have room to grow, but it is a spectrum.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely. And I think when it comes to the experiences of trauma or PTSD or any mental health condition or disorder or stress, that we all exist on a continuum at some point in time, and that will flex and change. And whether we tip over into diagnostic criteria because of some reason, then that happens sometimes, and then other times we're not there on that spectrum. But specifically with the studies that we're talking about, we're focusing first on the tip of the iceberg. I like that analogy, because it's a doorway, right? And it's one that is a very important doorway to get the evidence to show that these tools work in the treatment, to be able to open the door wider for our broader experiences as human beings, to be able to address all of our experiences of stressors and traumas over time.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It reminds me of Stan Grof's work, where he talked about how we all, it kind of goes back through, well, let me backtrack. Western psychiatry has sort of looked at sort of the beginning of life and on, but kind of missed birth trauma and sort of prenatal, and then also the transpersonal realms. And these are experiences that we all have as human beings, both from before we incarnate, while we're in the womb, and then in our childhood. Whether you have PTSD or not, all of those experiences are encoded, and the psychedelic state allows us to go back and start to process and work through that stuff that's stored inside of us and release it so that we're more free. And I can speak from my own experience of a guided MDMA session where I was right back in the womb, and I saw that part of my soul had left in the womb and it came back in, and I became more fully incarnated through that experience. I don't have post-traumatic stress. I wasn't having any of the symptoms that were described. But since that experience, I felt way more alive, more whole, more vital. So I think that these experiences are going to be fundamental for all human beings, whether they have a clinical diagnosis or not.
Yes, I completely agree with that. And when I'm working with my trauma populations with the Neurofeedback protocol, I definitely talk with them about the fact that PTSD is really just this rigidity or an inability for the entire cascade to align. It's oftentimes they've even lost the ability to activate the prefrontal cortex, and so they're more stuck in these early predictive processes. And so helping them understand that PTSD is a label, but what is it labeling, and how do you gain access again to the natural flexibility of your nervous system, and also helping them understand that it's not a deficit, it's often a flexibility and a resiliency, and that your nervous system is just trying to protect you, whether that be from an ancestral trauma and you were just born with a very anxious nervous system, and so you just get a sense that your set point was naturally a little bit quicker, and so that's just kind of what you're working with, just like some of us are born tall and some of us are born short. It's not a deficit, it's just how your nervous system is. And so broadening the idea of even what PTSD is by understanding you're just kind of not able to move through those states, I think is a...
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, all four of you, for those beautiful and illuminating talks. They were amazing. The question I have, as we look forward and envision a world where all psychedelics are legalized here in Canada, my fear or my concern is that these treatments would become extremely cost prohibitive, and that the Canadians that need them the most, those living on disability incomes, homeless Canadians, we can argue probably 95% of homeless Canadians are living in the fallout of PTSD. How can we make sure that once we do see legalization, that these drugs are accessible, these clinical grade drugs are accessible to those who need them the most?
Yeah, it's such an important question. Thank you. You know, when we need to lobby government for policy change, and what needs to happen in order for policy change to happen is something needs to be on the government's agenda near the top. There needs to be lobby groups within the population that are actively lobbying government, and then there needs to be positive public opinion also influencing. And when those three factors align, that's when we see policy change. So people like all of you out here really need to get active, whether that's joining lobby groups and being part of that voice, whether that's petitioning or writing letters to your local politicians. But really, you know, the systems that we're living in, you know, they are slow to change. But ensuring that Canadians have access to these types of innovative therapies in the future, and also just as I spoke about in my talk, mental health care in general, you know, just access to psychotherapy is something that I really encourage all of us to really get active in demanding. Certainly there's been recent commissions like the one I talked about in my talk that are proposing these things to the government of Canada. So just be an active citizen, and that's how we're going to make change happen.
1000%, totally agree. That and one thing that we're doing in the short term at Remedy. So Remedy is a Center for Mental Health Innovation that I'm with in Toronto, and we are a social venture, meaning that we're a clinic, but our profit goes back into funding research, and that means that we'll be, you know, able to keep going with the work in a way that's sustainable and not reliant on, for example, government grants or philanthropy over time. And that's important to be able to keep it going, to keep showing the evidence. But also what that means is that what's interesting is the philanthropy that comes in, which has been incredibly important. It's the only reason we're doing this work, is potentially going to be able to be redirected. And one thing we're doing is we're setting up a charitable arm to be able to offer psychedelic assisted psychotherapies to folks who can't afford them, and that will be able to be done through philanthropy. So to be able to redirect the philanthropy there by being able to fund the research ourselves from the actual proceeds from the other clinical work that we're doing. So that's our short-term solution to the longer-term hope of being able to influence policy on a greater level.
All right, next question. I'm right over here.
Hi, so I'm actually 20 years old and my friend is turning 20 in a month. So I had a question because I've been kind of interested in researching like psychedelic medicine since I was around 18, just out of my own curiosity. And I was just wondering, like, what are the efforts into educating our youth on this new research, and how can we have a voice as well to even speak to our parents who, you know, because like not maybe us personally may not be suffering from like PTSD or a mental illness, but perhaps we're living with a parent who does, and they may be reluctant to these new studies because, you know, some parents have very like conservative views on psychedelic drugs. And perhaps they've had, you know, a not so good experience with regular therapy, and just kind of how can we like segregate the idea of drugs as being like partying and like getting messed up to actually having like a spiritual benefit as well as a mental health benefit. Thank you.
I love that question because that's been something, I'm not 20 anymore, but something I've grappled with as someone who like did not have those conversations with my parents. And it's been hilarious being like, so guess what research I'm doing? And guess who's having these experiences? And should we talk about this? But part of that was actually finding ways of sharing the information that is accessible to our parents, but also to each other. And so whatever means that is. So for example, for my mom, it was reading Michael Pollan's book because she already knew who Michael Pollan was. She got really excited about that. She's like, got it. Like, I identify with him. He's of my generation. I understand his journalism. Great. When it comes to my friends, maybe it's sharing a documentary that really hits a chord that they're like, oh, I've never thought about it in that way before. So there's, it could be whatever way in is able to show you that information. Like if someone loves nature, like Fantastic Fungi is a great one. Or if there's a new documentary out called Dosed, right? So that one is showing more of a journey experience. So I think speaking the language of whoever it is that you're trying to share the information with is the way to share that experience, in my perspective anyway.
The best thing you can do when you want to help someone else change is change yourself. The positive ripple effects with your own healing inspire others. Rather than telling them to change and continue to raise your vibration, heal your past, and through that you will inspire them. They'll come to you. And when people come to you, they're much more open, they're not defended, and then they're really much more receptive to the information. I've seen this time and time again with patients as they're healing. It catalyzes healing in their family systems and in their communities. And so again, with young people doing psychedelics, we're thinking a lot about setting and integration. So these are like principles that we want to be teaching anyone who's using a psychedelic, whether that's in a therapy study or on their own. So encouraging people to learn principles of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy so that they can start to put that into practice. And I think that integration is such a huge piece. So we're thinking of, it's not just psychedelic experience, it's just one part of it, but what are you going to do with that experience after? So those would be some of the things that I would look into, start to read about, educate yourself, go to workshops.
I think normalizing too that state shifting is something that humans are capable of, and that exercising it is generally like exercising our brains, and that psychedelics is just one form of how you can exercise your brain. And when you think about whether you're meditating or whether you're dancing or whether you're dreaming, that all of this is really healthy for your brain, and starting to reframe it that way as opposed to how it has been used in society, but that the science is starting to show us that it's just generally a way of maintaining wellness and then flexibility in the neural networks in your brain.
So I echo everything that's been said. And also, if you have access to, everyone has access really to the World Wide Web to look into papers that explain the safety data around psychedelics on a population level. There have been some great studies that have come out looking at the United States Drug and Alcohol surveys for large population sets, and what those essentially show is that drugs, alcohol, tobacco, and amphetamine-based drugs, and cannabis as well, generally tend to lead to more negative outcomes on the population level, whereas psychedelics, including psilocybin and LSD, DMT, lifetime history of using those in comparison to the others is actually associated with less hospital admission for psychiatric diagnoses, less mental illness overall, and there was even a beneficial effect or protective effect against suicide associated with psilocybin use, lifetime psilocybin use. So if your people tend to be people that respond to research, you can actually go, there's you really need to know, everyone needs to know about this. I think Sci-Hub, if you find Sci-Hub, it's like a pirating software for research papers. So you don't have to pay for them. You can just look them up on PubMed, get the DOI and punch it into Sci-Hub and then get any research paper that you want. So that is another method as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Information should be free to everyone.
So we got room for 2 more questions. And I'm trying to diversify who is getting to ask questions here. Throwing up the back here.
Hi, thank you. So I'm wondering, in circumstances where a person has frequently used MDMA and ketamine and things like that in the past, at heavy rates, not necessarily LSD and psilocybin, because I know that those don't really impact the brain and body in the long term in the same way that heavy use of MDMA and ketamine can. I'm just wondering, would that impact the potential therapeutic use in the future, or would that impact the effectiveness?
So that's a question that we actually don't know the answer to scientifically at the moment. What we do know is that when you're using MDMA or ketamine in a psychotherapeutic context, it is extremely different from the use outside of a psychotherapeutic context. They're very malleable to setting and context. So the felt experience is going to be vastly different. What we ask in our clinical trials is that folks haven't had an experience for a period of time, so they've at least had some time before they're using one of these substances again, so that they're able to, for example, with MDMA, you have an immense release of neurotransmitters when you're using MDMA, and it takes quite a long time for your neurotransmitters to build back up to their baseline levels. The massive drop and the build-up happens fairly quickly over several weeks, but then actually getting back to a complete baseline can take months to, in some cases there's even data shows a full year. So when we're enrolling people in the study, we're requesting that they've not had any use of MDMA. I believe it's in the past 6 months. And right now it's also that they've only had a certain number of lifetime doses. Granted, that's not going to be the case necessarily over time, but that's how it is at the moment.
Yeah, I think right now you're excluded from the studies if you've used it more than 10 times in your lifetime. So again, we can't kind of scientifically answer that question. I think that ketamine, is the one that has the highest potential for addiction. And so I think what's interesting though is ketamine's also a potential treatment for addiction. It's got sort of emerging evidence for alcohol use disorder, for opiate use disorder, and at a psychedelic dose may kind of get at attachment trauma and kind of heal what underlies a lot of addiction. So there's a lot of interesting questions to come, I think, that hopefully we can research in the coming years.
And your question really points to what you also spoke about already, Emma, the influence of set and setting, and just something that we all feel passionate about, which is this is psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And we can't forget that. It's not just about the properties of the chemical, but it's how that acts in the context of a safely held setting with therapists who really know how to create the best conditions for healing. And that's like, if you think about a wound, like if you cut your arm, you want to keep it clean and dry and covered so that the innate healing wisdom of the body can do its job. And that's the kind of setting that gets created with the psychotherapeutic holding with these substances. So it's going to be very different from recreational or, and I'm not to downplay recreational use or say that's bad or wrong at all, and people do have their own set of benefits sometimes from that setting, but it's very different in the context of healing.
Awesome, thank you. We have room for one more question, and what I want you to just dig deep inside and ask yourself, has this question been asked, or is it going to diversify for today? This homie's had his hand up for the whole time, so I gotta share it for him. But one thing I wanted to share is that something that I've learned in 30 years that's been extremely healing is warmth and precision. And to see the warmth that's up on stage right now, the precision that's coming out of the mic, has been phenomenal.
I was just wondering, what are the chemical compounds of MDMA? Like, how are they made, and where does it originate from?
Okay, so it was originally made in 1912 in Germany. It was a German chemist. I think his name is Anton Kolisch, and they were deriving chemicals. They were looking at hemostasis drugs, and it was sort of not particularly interesting. It was a side compound when they were kind of making other more interesting versions of it. So it but they patented it, and then the next group of people to look at it was the U.S. Army in the 1950s, and then, as Anne mentioned, it was Alexander Shulgin who re-synthesized it. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. That's sort of where it's originally from. Are you curious?
Like, is there a plant origin?
I don't believe there's a plant. Someone asked me this actually. Sassafras is the one that came from a plant. Okay. Okay. So people in the audience know more about this.
Sassafras would be the natural analog, but the actual MDMA that we're using in studies is completely synthetic. Like, it's not coming from a plant source.
One more? Do we have room for one more? I'm getting we have room for one more. Okay, cool. Oh, how do I decide this? I don't even know. Hey, group decide. Everybody pointing whoever it should. Really? This is where you're Oh, it's a birthday.
Hi, so I just want to say thank you all. You're all inspiring. Having women speak about this topic is so important to everyone. So my question kind of ties in all the questions that were asked. I'm interested in this kind of research and this kind of healing towards refugees. And in Canada, we've experienced an influx, and honestly, the world, from wars to climate change. This is a real problem that's happening right now. And I know that you have put up a slide about 2 studies that are going to be conducted in Israel, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So I'm wondering if you can answer. I have so many questions. Oh my God, I need to focus more. Okay. Yeah. So, do you know how they're planning on integrating that into things like the occupation that's happening in Palestine? And also when you're doing therapies, and I know you've spoken about this Iranian fella that you worked with. Do you bring someone in that is from their culture to speak with them, to talk to them, and speak their same language? You know, and just one more thing. Yeah, World Wide Web is not available to everyone. I'm sorry to say, it is not. It is not. Not everyone has access to that. So it is a privilege, and those of us who have it, we should use it. Cool. Yes. Super nervous.
Thank you for that question. I'll just sort of pre-associate to some of what you said. I think the cultural context is so important, and I know that MAPS is really making a concerted effort to train people from specific cultures. So they had a specific training down in Kentucky for people, sort of African American and Black Americans, to be trained in specifically helping people with racial trauma. And so that the people from the back group who've had some of those experiences themselves can kind of offer a deeper and more shared understanding. In our case with our participant from Arman, like neither of our therapists shared his culture, but there was a lot of discussion around the role of culture and how a lot of the trauma was also from when he came into Canada and his difficulty integrating into Canadian society and some of the challenges that he faced. So a lot of that was processed. As far as working with refugees, I know that MAPS is trying to recruit some of them into the phase 3 studies. A lot of the refugees, I think one thing to remember about refugees is the ones that have made it to Canada often have incredible resilience. But there is a small subset of them that do have post-traumatic stress, and I think that we should be seeing how this model can help that population. As for Israel, I'll leave you with the name of a documentary. Do you remember the name of the documentary? It's Trip of Compassion. It's a documentary made on MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in Israel, and I think that would provide you more information on that.
I'll just echo what Emma said, and also that I know as the psychedelic work continues, and particularly those studies that we're running in Canada, we're really trying to put an emphasis on the diversity of folks that we're hoping to have come into the studies. And that's been a real paucity in other studies that have run. The vast majority of participants are white, vast majority of the participants are straight, and vast majority of the participants are not of different SES. And so that is a huge factor and thing that we need to consider. And I know, for example, our studies running in Toronto, that's going to be a huge factor in who we're spreading the information to and building connections with when we're starting to recruit into our studies.
Awesome. Maybe we want to, if that makes it a wrap, let's give a round of applause.